Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new TEAM therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 47 of the Feeling Good podcast. And David, we have an announcement before we start with today's topic.
Right. There's still time if you're interested in registering for the upcoming intensive in Burlingame, California. It'll be a 4-day intensive from July 30th to August 3rd.
2017.
2017. That's right. And it's for mental health professionals. It's my best training of the year. We'd love to have you attend. We have a lot of fun. It's long hours. There's 2 evening sessions, but it can be a real career and life-changing experience. If you're interested, go to iahb.org/intensive.
Yeah.
iahb.org/intensive, and there you'll find the brochure and all of the details.
Great. I can vouch for this. I've attended your intensive, and it is a lot of fun, and it is a great learning experience.
Thank you, Fabrice.
And so today, the topic is something that I had in mind for a while, and that is really the title of the eBook that you sell to therapists who take your Tuesday group training at Stanford. And you call this eBook Tools, Not Schools of Therapy. And I tend to be a fan of this approach, which is actually not an approach. It's more about let's see what works, and without really getting circumscribed within a particular modality or some even cultish type of approach.
Right.
Now, I know that TEAM really kind of arose out of CBT. So CBT for a lot of people is considered to be a school, even if it's a very mainstream one. How would you explain your choice to go for the tools rather than particular schools of therapy?
Well, what I'm hoping for, perhaps with too much idealism, perhaps not, is a radical transformation of the whole field of psychiatry and psychology and psychotherapy that's traditionally consisted of schools that kind of compete with each other. And I don't want to be too cynical in the way I describe this. Sometimes I get a little bit carried away, and I don't want to offend people. But the schools of therapy compete almost like religions or cults. You've got your cognitive therapy school, your psychodynamic school, your EMDR, your Adlerian. In fact, I think a new school of psychotherapy springs up almost every week somewhere in the world, and some of them, catch on, and some of them drop by the wayside.
Yeah.
But the problem is that they all seem to think they know the cause of mental health problems like depression and anxiety and relationship conflicts and habits and addictions, and they all have one set of specific techniques that someone has created that they use for all of these different ailments. What I'm trying to create is a data-driven a systematic school of therapy, a science-based school of psychotherapy that can draw on many tools from many schools of therapy, but works systematically to individualize the therapy for each individual. And we can talk about this from a variety of perspectives, but as a psychiatrist, I trained as a physician, and you don't have schools of medicine. Can you imagine, like, if we had schools of medicine like schools of therapy?
Yeah.
And so you break a leg and you go to a doctor and he prescribes penicillin. And you say, why are you prescribing penicillin? I have a broken leg. Don't I need a cast? And the doctor might say, oh, but I'm a penicillin doctor.
Yeah.
I specialize in treating people with penicillin. So if you have a broken leg, a brain tumor, penicillin's good for what ails you. That would seem, like Alice in Wonderland. And yet, that's how our field right now is functioning for the most part. For example, if you have depression and you go to a psychoanalytic therapist, what kind of therapy will you get?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not that well versed in psychodynamic therapy, but I would...
Or say psychoanalytic.
Psychoanalytic, yeah. I would suspect that they would look for family of origin issues and try to get some interpretations on how the depression would...
Right, we call that psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
And if you go with a marital problem, what treatment will you get from a psychoanalyst?
Probably something similar, except on an interpersonal basis.
Yeah, you'll get psychoanalysis. And
yeah.
If you've got a habit or addiction, you'll get psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
If you have a personality disorder, narcissistic personality, you'll get psychoanalysis. And if you were to go to a cognitive therapy, you'll get cognitive therapy.
That's
and
right,
if you go to an EMDR therapist, you'll get EMDR.
Yeah.
An Adlerian therapist, you'll get Adlerian therapy.
Yeah.
And to me, that never made a lot of sense. We've received a lot from the schools of therapy. They generally had some powerful figurehead leading the school who had some really good insights about human nature, and generally, not always, but generally that person had a one or two or three good techniques. But the problem is, it's that when you join a school of therapy, you begin to see everything through one theory and treat everything with one approach, and it becomes very limited. A young man emailed me not too far back, and I wrote a little blog on this, about a year ago or so, on my website, feelinggood.com, and he was a graduate student in psychology, some form of psychology, and he said that his teachers had said that you have to try the different schools of therapy on and see which one fits you the best, and then sign up for that school of therapy. And he asked me what was the best school of psychotherapy to sign up for, in my opinion. And the gist of my answer was, don't sign up for a school of therapy. Let's move into the future with a science-based, data-driven type of psychotherapy that calls on the best of all of these different schools, the tools from all the different schools of therapy that can be helpful.
Well, something seems, at least at this time in the field, something that seems to be happening is that somebody finds a tool, let's say EMDR, for example, and EMDR was initially applied for trauma and PTSD. So you start with a tool, and then around this tool you have an accretion of variations and more methods. Then EMDR goes from a tool to being a school,
right?
And it starts being applied to this and that.
Yes, and then people love it because they have one simple thing that they can learn to do that they can treat everyone with. So it's kind of like a simple solution, but it never made much sense to me. Another problem with the schools of therapy, well, there's a number of problems with it, but another one is they all have some kind of theory that's generally can't be proven scientifically. And if you have a good database and you test the theories that most of these schools of therapy based on, you can virtually always show that the therapy can be discredited, the theory can be proven to be false.
Isn't that a problem, though? Because that would make psychotherapy a discipline that would be like an orphan discipline. Because if you look at medicine and its various specialties, there are some theories about why we have ailments and medical problems.
Well, some people believe that a wrong theory is better than none at all. I don't personally.
Okay.
And I can just give one brief example of that there's a school of therapy for depression called the interpersonal therapy.
Yeah.
And it was developed by Clairman and I think Myrna Weissman and Gerald Clairman, if I recall correctly. And it's based on the idea that depression is caused by a lack of loving relationships, and that people who are depressed they're needy, they've been rejected, they're alone, and so they need to be trained to improve their relationships.
Yeah.
Or have some treatment aimed at that, and people like to believe that because it sounds good. I did a research study on this. It's actually a difficult thing to study statistically because you've got potentially a vicious cycle going on there. Like poor relationships could trigger depression. And
depression could trigger poor relationships, yeah.
Exactly. So you've got a circular causality, so you need special type of statistical modeling to estimate those causal loops.
Right.
And so I did a study called Intimacy and Depression. Is there a causal connection? And published it in the top psychology journal for clinical research, the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology. And I was helped by a statistician from Harvard, Professor Gary King, one of the top stats guy at Harvard, kind of showed me how to do this type of, it's called non-recursive statistical modeling, where you get it causal loops.
Okay.
And I modeled the data in hundreds of patients that we treated in Philadelphia at my clinic who came with depression, and many of them had very poor relationships and were severely depressed at intake. And then I was able to look at the relationship between bad marriages, bad relationships, and depression as these things fluctuated during the first 12 weeks of treatment. And what we showed was that there's significant correlation between bad relationships and depression. The correlation was minus 0.40.
Yeah.
The more depression you have, the worse your relationships are, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But showed pretty conclusively that there were no meaningful causal links between these two. It was not true that bad relationships had an important causal effect on depression. And it was not true that depression was a meaningful cause of troubled relationships, troubled marriages.
Yeah.
And we published that again in the top journal. But the people who were in the interpersonal school have never quoted that article or alluded to it because it doesn't confirm their theory, the thing that they...
Well, if they were to quote it, they might just have to leave their school.
Exactly. And that's why the schools of therapy are like cults or religions. It would be like trying to convince the Pope that holy water really isn't holy. You had to say, hey, we got a new study at Stanford in the Department of Chemistry, and we've proven that taking holy water is actually just water. You know, I don't think the Pope, maybe he's enlightened enough he wouldn't mind, but I think a lot of Catholics would just be offended. They wouldn't like that study. They wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. And so I would love to see the field move to say goodbye to the schools of therapy historically, and have a new science of psychotherapy based on data collected at the start and end of every single therapy session. And in the team therapy, we have I've borrowed tools, developed or borrowed tools from many, over a dozen schools of therapy. And sometimes one tool will do it for one person, and another person with the exact same problem, it'll be a radically different tool that will allow them to suddenly recover.
Now, you're, student number 5 of Aaron Beck's, and, when you look at the number of methods and techniques that you use in TEAM. In fact, the synonym for TEAM is TEAM-CBT, so it uses a lot of cognitive behavioral techniques. Would you call yourself a CBT therapist?
I'd say I'm an anti-CBT therapist and an anti-psychoanalytic therapist and an anti-psychodynamic therapist and a super anti-EMDR therapist. And I'm really just kind of pretty emotionally and intellectually fiercely opposed to all the schools of therapy. And I wish people would resign from their schools of therapy and join the new database science-based movement. Another thing I'll mention, although I don't want to get overly cynical or controversial here, but one of the grandfather of cognitive therapy was Albert Ellis.
Yeah.
And he's a very controversial guy. He was, intensely narcissistic and kind of a wild guy, and he used the F word every third word that came out of his mouth when he would give workshops.
Yeah.
But he would always draw huge crowds because half the people were idolizing him and half the people came to kind of hate him, type of thing. So
to see the show.
Yeah, that's right. And but he was a very smart guy, and he talked about the importance of cognitions, thoughts on how we feel and behave. And I admired him, so I'd always speak highly of him in workshops.
Mm-hmm.
He was very honest, and he had a real sense of integrity, so I admired that about him. And word got back to him, Burns is one of your fans, and so at banquets and stuff, on occasion I would be seated right next to him because he knew I liked him. And he used to talk about that he had known most of the greats from psychiatry and psychology in the 20th century, as well as many people who are well known today.
Yeah.
And he told me, which was hard to hear at first, that most of them were pretty narcissistic individuals who, on a personal level, weren't the way that people thought they were, and that they were kind of exploitative and dishonest, that they stole ideas from others, and that they promoted things in a kind of a false or unethical way. And I had to admit, in reflecting on my own experience, having known a number people in that superstar category, that rang true with my own experiences as well, and I think it's sad and strange that people seem to want to line up with narcissistic figureheads who they can't seem to see through. I, of course, am the delightful exception to the rule, but there's
nobody worships you, right?
But I think it's a problem, and it's not the thing that's gonna carry us into the future, is following these people who keep coming up with the answers, so to speak. And I apologize if I'm offending anyone, because you may be listening right now and be a strong advocate of your psychodynamic approach, or your this approach, or your that approach. But I feel pretty strongly about this.
Yeah. Well, when you look at the tools that you teach, they work really well with cognitive and also behavioral techniques, because you apply this to the thinking and to distorted beliefs. But how do you plug other methods from other approaches into TEAM?
Yeah. We've got cognitive techniques and TEAMs, behavioral techniques, motivational techniques, paradoxical techniques, spiritual techniques, Rogerian techniques, Gestalt techniques, humor-based, on and on.
What spiritual technique would you have, for example, in TEAM?
Well, when we could do another podcast on this great question that you just asked, but going back, 2,500 years to the time of Buddha talked about the great death, the death of the ego.
Yeah.
And when we're training therapists to become TEAM therapists, there's actually 3 deaths of the therapist ego that are required to do good treatment, and also there's 3 deaths of the ego involved for patients. There's a death of the ego in recovery from depression. There's a completely different death of the ego in recovery from anxiety, and yet a third radically different death of the ego in healing a troubled relationship with someone that you're at odds with. And when you do great therapy at the moment of recovery, when someone before your very eyes has gone from tears and sobbing to suddenly laughter and joy and just recovery in that instance, more often than not, that is a spiritual experience. The acceptance paradox, the externalization of voices, those are techniques to bring about not only recovery, but also what we could call a spiritual enlightenment. And the religion of the person will influence the way they interpret it. Like someone in the Christian religion might interpret this experience as a death and rebirth, or death and resurrection. Something in that metaphor. But at its deepest level, I think truly great therapy, where you're transforming somebody's life, is inherently spiritual work. My father was a Lutheran minister, and my parents couldn't have children, and so they adopted two girls who came from a troubled family. I think they were 5 or 6 when they were adopted, and then my brother was adopted at birth, and then 17 months later, suddenly my mom got unexpectedly pregnant, and then I was born.
Your papa?
And my father was so excited. I was born on an early Sunday morning, and he said it was the only day he couldn't preach a sermon. He was so excited. But he named me David D. Burns, D.D. Burns. He was Lyle Charles Burns, D.D., Doctor of Divinity. It was an honorary doctor's degree.
Okay.
So he was sure that one day I would be D.D. Burns, D.D.
Oh, I see.
And in fact, when I was little, I always thought I'm going to be a minister when I grow up. But I remember when I was in 7th grade, I was talking to my mom, and she said, you might consider being one day D.D. Burns, M.D. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, you'll be able to help people like your dad, but you'll get paid for it. But
she was a smart woman.
Yeah. But it's interesting that here, kind of toward the latter phase of my career, I think it is taking on much more of a spiritual base, and I think, sometimes I'm preaching that sermon that my dad never got to preach, because these things, when humans change, it is a jaw-dropping phenomenon. And I'm not just talking about when you go to therapy and talk for 8 or 9 years and nothing happens. I'm talking about when your depression suddenly vanishes in an instant, and I see this all the time. That's like Paul on the road to Damascus, if you want to take a Christian perspective, or Saul. He was this murderer of Christians, and then he had this flash of enlightenment, and he became Paul, one of the early apostles. And really, in my experience, recovery is frequently on that magnitude from the perspective of the person who's recovering.
Yeah, and so, as TEAM develops, and I'm certain that a lot of people will start bringing new developments to the model, how do you suggest that people integrate new tools?
Well, I think that I have a list of 50 basic techniques that I use in training. You've seen 50 Ways to Untwist Your Thinking, and I published it in my psychotherapy eBook
and they're
as well.
Mostly cognitive, right?
Well, there's a lot of cognitive, but there's 2, 4, 6. They're taken from a dozen schools of therapy, because we got visual hypnotic tools as well, quantitative schools, semantic tools, psychoanalytic tools, humorous tools. There's a lot of them, but the way I did it personally is I have lots of flaws. and a few strengths. No. I have tons of flaws, but a few strengths. And one of my strengths is I'm really creative. And so I can make up, even to this day, I make up new tools every time I have a therapy session with someone. I might even make up 3 like this week. Yeah. So I use probably more than 50, probably 100 or more tools. But the way I do, if I come up with something, like say the paradoxical double standard technique was a technique I made up. It was based on something that a therapist named Maxie Maltzby had created, but I turned it into a role play technique. Mm-hmm. And it's what would you say to a dear friend who is like, you have all your negative thoughts, I'm worthless, I'm no good, I'm a loser, someone in exactly your circumstances, and then you play the role of a dear friend who's just like the patient, and you say, gee, this has happened to me, and I've been telling myself I'm unlovable, I'm no good, and most of the time the patient will suddenly come up with very realistic, compassionate, undistorted, positive thoughts that are really helpful. Well, the way I have done it is if the first time I saw that work, I said, wow, this is fantastic. Then I tried it on several more patients, and I used to give myself the rule, if I have a new tool that works for 4 or 5 patients, then I can add that to the list, give it a name, and start teaching it to other therapists. That's how I've always done it, and I never cared too much, what school of therapy this technique might represent, or new school of therapy. The important thing is, can you show with data, measurements at the beginning and end of the session, that tool will cause rapid and dramatic changes in depression levels, anger levels, anxiety levels. That's how I have created team therapy. We need to have a lot of research to back up some of these new developments that seem so exciting.
So you're saying that the only tools that are worth including would have to have an immediate effect within the course of one session?
Not necessarily, but for the most part, that's what I'm looking for. And I'm just talking from my own personal experience that, having spent years developing my craft, I typically see dramatic changes within a single session. If I'm using one or more tools in a session that aren't helping someone, then the next session I'll try different tools. I don't just keep hacking away with the same thing over and over. Yeah. If it doesn't work, because I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of ways of helping people break out of depression, anxiety, anger, or whatever is bothering them.
Now, it seems to me...
But let me just say one more thing.
Sure.
The team therapy, it would be misleading to say that it's mainly cognitive. It has a lot of cognitive therapy, but a tremendous amount that's new and different. Particularly the motivational tools, like the paradoxical agenda setting, is really based on a motivation revolution that I think is as big as the cognitive revolution that gave birth to cognitive therapy, and it's kind of adding 1 + 1 = 3 or something like that. There's a tremendous synergy when you know how to melt away the patient's resistance, and then you've got all these cognitive techniques and behavioral techniques and, quantitative techniques and, Rogerian and spiritual and paradoxical. All these techniques it's like cognitive therapy on steroids once you take away the patient's resistance and boost the patient's motivation. It's like, it's really jaw-dropping. It's like a magical effect.
Yes, I agree with you. I know that the motivational revolution is really what the wave that you're essentially both creating and writing. But what I was thinking, in my experience, is that when you do therapy with a couple, for example, you have a two-person system. And things don't seem to necessarily move as quickly as they might when you are working directly with a single patient.
Yeah, and I did a blog on that recently, and that's one of the things I'm trying to understand. If I'm working with someone who's depressed and anxious, I have an excellent chance of seeing them have a dramatic or complete elimination of symptoms in a single therapy session, particularly if I can have 2 hours with the person. I can usually more or less complete the treatment. But when someone has relationship problems, it takes much longer typically, and the tools are quite different. One of the reasons, and I'm not sure I understand all the reasons why it's so much harder for people to develop loving relationships than it is to overcome depression and anxiety. But one of the things is you've got both an external problem and an internal problem as well. The external problem has to do with the way we communicate and relate to the other person we're in conflict with. We get defensive and we argue and we blame and we insist that we're right and the other person is wrong, and that will always cause the problem to escalate. And it's very difficult for people to let go of that and look at their own role because of what we were talking about earlier, the death of the ego. Once you see your own role in the problem, when you were blaming the other person and feeling so morally superior, it's very, very painful.
Yeah.
And people resist that pain and they want to keep, blaming and fighting. But in addition, there's an internal dialogue going on that has to change. You're often telling yourself that, I'm being criticized, I can't stand it, this means I'm no good. You're kind of beating up on yourself internally while you're battling the other person externally, and learning to change that inner dialogue is also, and it can be an important task of a therapy, so that you've got, two entirely different new sets of tools you may have to learn in order to develop more loving relationships.
So circling back to what we were saying earlier, if someone were to bring in some new tools into the interpersonal work, those tools might not work, right away in one session. So what would be the criteria to decide to include such tools into TEAM?
There's a fantastic answer to that, and Fabrice will now reveal what it is because I can't think of any.
All right, well, this would be a good opportunity for our listeners to comment on this. Yeah. Please go to the show notes and leave your comments, and we'll be listening to the collective wisdom. How about that?
Yeah.
Well, unless you have something else to add, this will conclude our episode on the tools, not schools of therapy.
Thank you, Fabrice.
Well, thank you, David.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donzel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.